Agronomist for Ceres Solutions, and she works with around 12 counties in western Indiana. She's involved with the technical and economic recommendations and training and diagnostics for Ceres in the southern 4 counties. She has a BS from Purdue. Aha, good deal. And she kind of drifted a little bit and got her master's from Nebraska, but that's okay, we like Nebraska too. Also, Jeff, he's an agronomist too with Ceres, and he stayed the course, right? Purdue all the way, and we're thankful for that. But we appreciate the work he does. He does a lot of training and technical support. He works as a crop specialist at several retail locations working with farmers. And you've got a good practical background because you also farm 1,100 acres in your spare time, right? So here they are, and we hope that we can learn a lot from you today.
Good morning, everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear from the back of the room, but as Paul indicated, my name is Besty, and I share agronomist responsibilities with Jeff. And we're going to share this presentation today to talk a little bit about fertilizer requirements after a cover crop. We'll talk about some of our experiences that we've had, and then maybe how we might use some of the newer technology to look at nitrogen rates in crop. So go ahead and get started. So we know that cover crops can do a lot of things. Cover crops were popular 25 years ago, and what we really talked about was preventing erosion. But now the cover crop discussion is a lot different. It's talking about alleviating compaction, actually being that tillage for that no-till operation. Scavenging nutrients. Sometimes I talk a little fast. Scavenging nutrients, and I'll show you some pictures of that and some of the things that we found this past spring, as well as recycling nutrients. Improving soil organic matter, and I consult in an area that we can use every speck of organic matter that we can build. It's similar to some of the areas that Barry comes from too. Suppressing weeds, that's some of our discussion here lately with mare's tail in parts of the territory that we consult in, is just what cover crops can do for us weed suppression wise, and with that natural biological system, and then providing overwinter forages. So this is sort of, we might need the term. Okay, so this is one of the pictures that we took this past spring, talking about that way that we can scavenge nitrogen. This is a picture that I took, and I know it's hard to see looking down, but as we recall, last fall was pretty dry, last season was pretty dry, we still had a lot of nitrogen in play in the system. But in this area of the field, we actually had, from the previous spring, we had a knife that was plugged up on the anhydrous applicator, and this is an area where we had full nitrogen. And as you can see, there's really quite a bit of a stark difference. You can actually see where that plugging happened in the field, and it's hard to show from this viewpoint, but really the cereal rye is lush and green. It was about 8 or 10 inches tall at the time that we took this in early April. Some of the cereal rye here isn't lush and green, so this is actually a picture of how that cereal rye really takes a hold of that nitrogen and grabs onto it, what we were talking about earlier. This year, because we had so many, and cover crops are very popular in the southern part, where I consult basically from Terre Haute to Vincennes is most of my experience level, and we were a tad bit drier, even though we were dry every place. There were a few more rains in other areas. Cover crops were very popular. Guys could see that nitrogen investment getting away when we finally got some rains. And so we did a lot of cover crops, and then this spring we decided that we would take some biomass measurements. And the biomass measurements is actually just removing a section of your cover crop field where it's an average condition, actually clipping it off to within a ½ inch, quarter of an inch, weighing it for a wet weight, and then sending it in from the lab to get for the analysis. And we're actually looking here mostly at nitrogen. We also were able to find potassium and phosphorus and all of our major nutrients. But these are just some differences in what we found. You can see that the seeding dates, there were a wide variety of seeding dates. There's a wide variety of cover crops. I'll tell you that the CR is cereal rye, CC is crimson clover, and then the ARG is annual ryegrass. So from all of those mixes, we were able to scavenge anywhere from 69 to 143 pounds, and that's quite a lot. Of course, we had a lot of nitrogen in the system, so there was a decent amount to scavenge. This is sort of what this looks like. So this is where we've removed, this was an annual ryegrass, just an annual ryegrass field, and it was even following soybeans. But this is where we placed this, where we removed that, and what we were able to find was about 73 total pounds of nitrogen, even following soybeans. As we look at what's, and then the next question you're going to ask is what's available the next year. And it sort of depends on what we do with it and the timing that we take it off. But what's in a no-till situation, probably only a quarter of it. If we would till it in, and we aren't necessarily talking about tilling it in, we can recover a little bit more nitrogen than in the no-till environment. This is what it looks like. This is a 20 by 20 inch square, so we place the square over an average area. This happens to be the Brazil mix, which is the cereal rye, crimson clover, and the radishes. Of course, the radishes had already died by the time we took some of these, and we didn't think about doing some of this in the spring. We actually, or in the fall. We did more of it in the spring. This year, we're going to have the opportunity to do it in the fall and in the spring both. But again, fairly similar. Now what we've got in that next, the other thing you might see here is a few weeds too. So not only when you do some of these biomass studies, you take the cover crop, but you also take off every weed that might be in that square too. But again, the first year is in that no-till about almost 20 pounds. And 20 pounds is some significant dollars. Now this is one where you can see we really didn't get as good a stand. We think that there might have been some herbicide issues, maybe some herbicide carryover. Maybe we didn't get the seed to soil contact in this field. And even though we see this fairly light level of cover crops, we still scavenged 25 pounds. That's 6 overall that could be available. So that just gives you a picture or a snapshot of what we were able to find. Now when we look about, we're talking about what's going to be available. These are some slides that I actually borrowed from Eileen Kladivko, and we're looking at the residue addition and nitrogen availability. Barry already touched on the carbon to nitrogen ratio, and that's where we need to start thinking about, how much nitrogen is going to be available. So on those high carbon residues, when we add those, and those are going to be the corn stover, or if we let cereal arrive, we're going to go corn after that if we let it grow. That high carbon to nitrogen ratio, the first thing that's going to happen is that the microbes are going to immobilize some of the available nitrogen there. So there's that, and we've got available soil N here and time here. So the first thing that happens as we get into the system, we're going to see some immobilization, taking some nitrogen from the system to break down the residue. Then over time, eventually we'll get that mineralization, but we don't know always when that's going to happen. With some of our high carbon to nitrogen residues as well as cover crops, it may not necessarily be that year. It's still in play. The nitrogen's still in play, but it just may not be for that year. When we look at the residue addition, though, where we've got low carbon residues, then there's essentially no immobilization, and then the mineralization time period starts fairly quickly. And when you look at some of the low carbon to nitrogen ratios, those are going to be some of our legumes. Legume hay, and I think that the annual ryegrass falls into right about that level too. It might be 19 to 1. This again is that carbon to nitrogen ratio, just another illustration of it. Looking at the differences, the rye cover crop in the vegetative stage is in that 26 to 1, and as we get higher, those are the residues, either from the cover crop or from what's left over in straw, that we're going to mobilize first. We'll take nitrogen from the system to break it down. So some general rules of thumb as we get ready for that system, and Barry touched on this already, and we'll just go ahead and reiterate some of that. So if you're looking at corn following rye, and we have done it successfully in Southwest Indiana, there are guys that are not scared of that, but what you've got to remember is that we do have to feed that system because it's a little higher carbon to nitrogen ratio. And it can be a little scary at times. We need to be looking at that 40 to 60 pounds depending on when we've killed that cover crop. Even if we kill it in that vegetative stage, we're still going to need to think about that 40 pounds at least as that cereal rye gets a little taller, a little older. That's where we're going to need to be sure that we've got the nitrogen in the system, because at V5, V6, when we start to determine yield, we want to be sure that we've got the nitrogen that they're available. Corn following annual ryegrass. Annual ryegrass is a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio, somewhere in that 30 to 45 pound range. 45-pound range is going to be that situation like we may have had this year, where the annual ryegrass, we sort of warmed up and got wet quick, so we couldn't get over all of our acres. So some of that started to head out. So that when the ryegrass starts to head out, you're going to want to think about higher nitrogen rates at planting as that starter nitrogen. Corn following crimson clover, as I talked to Barry, and of course I did ask Barry to be sure that my figures were about correct. He's still, any cover crop, even if it's a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio, still wants 30 pounds. Because we don't, even immediately after we kill it, we don't immediately get it released into the environment. So about 30 pounds in some crimson clover. If you've got cereal rye with it, we've got to consider both of those together. And then corn following radishes and oats in that 30 to 40 pound range. Because as you remember, when Hans talked about when it starts to release that, we've already got a corn crop that's growing, depending on when we planted it. If it's starting to release in June, we need to be sure that we've got the nitrogen available early for that corn crop. So what about other nutrients? And we're going to change gears. So we've talked a lot about nitrogen, and of course nitrogen in a corn system, when we're looking at no-tilling corn, is pretty important to get right early as we start to establish yield. What about other nutrients? And I'm going to change gears and talk about what we've been doing with our NutriSolutions tissue analysis program to talk about potassium, sulfur, phosphorus perhaps. So with our NutriSolutions program, it's a program, tissue analysis program that's really designed to find some hidden hunger. We take tissue samples at various growth stages to see what the crop can remove. A soil test does a great job of measuring what's available, but the tissue test gives you a snapshot in time of what that crop is able to remove. And these are some of the stages that we take. Wheat, corn, and soybeans, we're doing more with alfalfa, do a lot of specialty crops further south. So in corn and wheat, we take 2 vegetative stages followed by 1 reproductive stage, and in soybeans, it's 1 reproductive followed by, or 1 vegetative followed by 2 reproductive. Irrigated corn, because we can do some things fertigation-wise and be a little quicker to the draw if we're missing nutrition, we actually tissue sample a little more often than that. So what I'm going to show you now is some of the things that we've found over the last few years. And I don't have 2013 data in, but I can tell you it's much like 2011, where we were wet early and then we got dry. So this is the different stages that we've taken our tissue tests. Nitrogen, we're largely okay for the most part. We can always use a little work with nitrogen because it's a leaky system depending on when we get the rains, where our nitrogen is. But the first one I'm going to talk about is potassium. Early on in corn, B4 to B8, we're actually largely very good at potassium. The corn plant doesn't need a lot of potassium, and I'll show you here in a second a little bit more about that. But by the time we get to B9 and through BT, when we need a lot of potassium to build that stalk, we aren't keeping up. Some of it is our soil tests. About 40% of our soil tests are low in potassium, so it's not surprising we're going to find it low in the tissue. Of course, in 2012, we were so dry, we really needed, because potassium is taken up through the diffusion process in soil, that process wasn't working, so we were actually seeing a lot lower levels. But even by the time we get to the reproductive stage, we haven't necessarily caught up. This is just an illustration of where is potassium in the plant and how it is so important to the structure of the plant. This is a graph right here that indicates what plant parts potassium is a part of. Largely a part of the stalk and the leaf sheaths, the leaf blades. This is the shank. This is the yield portion, so this is what comes out in grain. So very little of it comes out in grain. And potassium is only one of the nitrogens that's not solely tied to yield in its function, but what it does is it helps other nutrition move in the plant. Very important to the structural integrity of the stalks and stems, and we all know that. We know that we've got low K-stats in our soil, so it doesn't get into the plant. We can have stalks, we can have lodging. Improves water and nitrogen use efficiency and involved in plant movement. So it's a very important nutrient. And Jeff and I are actually really concerned about potassium and being sure that we've got the potassium in our system. Probably that's our next most concerning nutrient versus nitrogen. This is one of the graphs that I've borrowed from Jeff on talking about the relationship to nitrogen and potassium. Actually, what this is trying to show is that if we've got the comparison in yield and nitrogen, the optimum nitrogen rate from soils that have 2 levels of potassium status. So this 80 part per million is about 160 pounds per acre, where this is this 139 parts per million is about 280 pounds per acre, which is where we would want to be in the types of soils around here, even our high organic. So it takes actually more nitrogen, the optimum rate is higher for less yield compared to where our K level is good in soils. So something to think about and something that we continue to be concerned about. The next one, and I'm only going to look at the highlights of what we're finding with our Nutri-Solutions. The next one is sulfur. And for us, I work with some sandy soils in the south. I work with low organic matter soils in the south. And sulfur was sort of our next big find with our Nutri-Solutions and understanding that sulfur piece a little bit more. Early on, again, at B4 to B5, we are seeing some responsiveness in deficient levels, largely okay. By the time we get to the B6 to B8 range, though, then it's a different picture. 2011 is different than 2012, and this year, 2013, behaved a little bit more like 2011. So sulfur is one of those that goes hand in hand with nitrogen to help build proteins, as we all know. And so sulfur is another one that also really fits a no-till system, because as we start to, as that soil starts to wake up and then sulfur is going to be neutralized, we might need a little bit of help with sulfur. Now, cover crops should help us with that. You noted one of the slides that talked about how much the tillage root was able to take out, and sulfur was one of those nutrients. But when is it released into our corn crops? So from B9 to BT, we're still in the responsive and deficient, as well as, now we recover some when we get to the reproductive phases. So sulfur is another one of our components that we're adding into more of our, again, light organic matter soils, sandy soils, and no-till soils. There's a lot of different ways that we can get sulfur, and sulfur is relatively inexpensive to add to your cropping rotation. There's liquid sulfur sources that are ammonium thiosulfate, ammonium sulfate, K-mag is dry, ammonium sulfate is dry too, K-mag is dry. So there's a lot of products. Gypsum, another really good product that provides us a good amount of sulfur. 90% sulfur is a little slowly available, so what we've got to work with is the soil bacteria and how it gets released into the crop and if it releases soon enough. And then the final one that we're going to look at, I will tell you that largely phosphorus, how it's delivered to the plant, we are largely okay in phosphorus with most of our systems in corn and soybeans. But we still need to pay attention and keep up with crop removal because a lot comes out in that corn crop. But zinc is the other one that we have found that early on when we're trying to develop roots, and it's very important to help with that root development, and corn is fairly responsive, that we are low in zinc. And we finally get into the reproductive side where we're largely adequate, but early on when we can to really beef up those roots and help access more parts of the soil, we are finding that zinc is one of those keys in that area. So this is just some pictures that Jeff took and showing the difference. This is a pop-up starter with 6-gallon 1030 fluorose and citric zinc. And just look at the root development, the difference in the root development from both of those products tied together. When you look at, and this is just a picture of the fertilizer alone, this is another growth promoter called Ascend, that we can add some things to the seed to really perk things up, look at the roots, and as well as improve the plant status. So the key insights from our Nutri-Solutions and from the work, and as we think about adding fertilizers or fertilizer following the cover crop with potassium, with sulfur, with zinc, we haven't been cover cropping long enough to know if we tissue sample. We did tissue sample some fields that were cover cropped to see if we could see any differences in nutrient status. We're still, the work that we're done, we're still using for fields that have been cover cropped. This was from last year, but a good potassium fertilization plan. I think Jeff and I can't stress that enough. And even in further south, we're applying potassium in crops with some of us, with high clearance spreaders, where we know that we can get it into the root zone. So a good potassium fertilizer program. Sulfur should be considered probably in a wider range of soils than what we have been as we develop protein and help with nitrogen efficiency, and then zinc is one that we're finding to help with that root development early. So, and further south, we need to watch magnesium, maybe not necessarily much of an issue around here, but one of the nutrients we watch further south in Indiana is magnesium. I am going to turn it over to Jeff at this point in time, and we will be around for questions, and we know that's sort of a tight turnaround.
Can you hear me? Very good. No heckling today. Okay. Great. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today. May have to turn that down here. I don't know. But just wanted to share a few thoughts a little bit as we think about nutrition following cover crops. And Betsy and I work with a farmer in southern Indiana. Two brothers farm about 6,000 acres. Got 2-3 sons coming back into the operation. And I had a conversation about a year ago with them, and they were kind of, after the drought, we knew there was probably nitrogen in there, but longer term, they were kind of thinking about their nitrogen program, and they're pretty much sold on cover crops. And their question was to us was, you know, we believe in cover crops, we're committed to that, but we're kind of renegotiating our cash rents right now, and I need to credit some nitrogen in that cover crop. And how much can I credit? And we're kind of like, well, that's a good question, right, Barry? I think Barry and Hans talked a little bit about the fact that you know, radishes and the cover crops, these release nitrogen to that corn crop. Betsy showed you some data just a little bit ago about the nitrogen in those cover crops. But from a farmer perspective and a practical standpoint is, you know, when does that become available and how do we count for it? Is that just bonus nitrogen, or is that something that we can sort of credit into our program and reduce the nitrogen that goes on that field? A fair question, right? So got us to think a little bit. So we started working about 2 years ago with some optical sensors, and I kind of wanted to share a little bit about some strategies here that may have a fit in terms of dealing with some of these questions. Before I do that, I just kind of want to review a little about nitrogen. How many of you are farmers in the audience here today? Okay. I think most of you are probably, when you go to the field, say for the crop year, you've got a certain nitrogen rate that you've got targeted in mind, and you're probably pretty comfortable that you're in the range of where you want to be at, but also probably a little uncomfortable that certain years you may be over or under applying nitrogen, because there's a huge interaction that goes on with the weather system. When you add cover crops, that even makes another interaction going on. So you're pretty comfortable, and we typically get questions in the springtime after you go through rainy periods like we did this year is, do I have enough nitrogen left to feed that corn crop? And that's a fair question to ask. But this is kind of where the industry has migrated since about the mid-2000s or so, kind of getting away from a nitrogen recommendation based on yield goal, because we knew that wasn't real great, and looking more at actual response on field trials. And this is, you can Google the nitrogen rate calculator. Some of you may have been on there kind of looking at that. And you plug in the price of corn, selling price per bushel. You plug in the price per pound of into nitrogen that you're buying it. And you get this kind of maximum return to nitrogen for cropping rotation. So this is corn after beans, based in west central and northwest Indiana, and would suggest that that would be somewhere around 170 pounds per acre. Okay, that's probably pretty close. Behind the scenes is what goes on here. And that is, we know that nitrogen is dynamic. We know there are areas in fields that probably would respond to more nitrogen. There's areas that would respond to less nitrogen, but we kind of pick a field average and we go with it. So if you look at the economic optimum N rate here versus the percent of the sites that are responding, if you had areas that only needed 125 pounds of N some years, then we over-apply nitrogen, right? And so that was an extra cost to the farming operation that we really didn't need. On the other hand, if you had years where you had high N loss, and you actually needed closer to 200 to 225 pounds of nitrogen, that would have paid to put it on, and you had 170, you were shorted that corn crop that year, right? And that's the reality that we deal with every year, is this kind of dynamics that takes place in terms of nitrogen management. This is some work from Peter Scharf, University of Missouri. He's done a lot of work with optical sensors. Did a very intensive study looking at what was the optimum N rate in a field about every quarter of an acre or so. And you can see that these blue areas, the nitrogen rate only needed to be close to 80 pounds of N. Whereas you get into the red and pink areas, you're looking 160 to 200 to 200 to 250 pounds of N. So big difference within a field, and that's probably reality, maybe not as extreme all the time, but cover crops aside, we know that nitrogen is a little bit of a guesstimate in any given year in any given field. So now you throw the cover crops into it, and Betsy showed you the data where some of the stuff from last fall in southern Indiana was capturing some of that nitrate and nitrogen. So let's think about this a little bit. So you have a crop going out here. The plant uptake, so we're capturing some of the nitrogen. Barry and Hans talked about that being there. You're kind of keeping that nitrogen in play a little bit. So last year we might have had a little bit of ammonium because it was dry, but by and large a lot of it was probably in that nitrate nitrogen form. And her data did indeed show that this is being taken up into the crop and that nitrogen is there. The question from a practical standpoint is, as Barry talked about, when you kill that cover crop, when does that nitrogen become available? Okay, how much can you count on? So eventually, once the cover crop has it taken up, you get a decomposition. And certain crops, and Betsy showed you that carbon-nitrogen ratio, and Barry showed it to you, you know, you're actually going to tie some nitrogen up with certain cover crops. So that's the importance of that extra in at planting time. But eventually, that's going to be released back into the system. We talked a little bit about, you know, crop residue. Some of this gets incorporated to organic material that at some point in time, that corn crop may very well see during the growing season. The question is how much nitrogen is released and how much can we count on? And that's the piece that really is sort of a struggle in terms of, you know, we know it's there, we know we're going to get some, how much and you know, what we can count on is one of the challenges with it. If you look at some of the research that Peter's looked at in terms of, you know, how do we explain nitrogen variability, you know, and in terms of a diagnostic standpoint, what tools can we use to predict whether we need more nitrogen? And these are the typical things we use. And one of the things is in terms of yield. Yield is not a great predictor of how much nitrogen we need. Okay, we'll talk a little bit why that's the case in a second. The other thing we use, is probably the best we have, and Betsy and I both use this tool a little bit, is the soil nitrate test. So if you kill off a cover crop, you would go out there, maybe about side dress stage corn, and you take the soil nitrate test to see what you have in terms of nitrate content and making some estimation of how much more N to apply. The issue here is that it has some effect. It's the best tool we have as far as a soil test. But if you're going to do it right, it's a very intensive test. You're taking 12-inch cores. You need to be taking 15, 20 cores per sample about every 10 to 15 acres. And how many of you think that sounds like a fun job, right? So the test has been out there. It's been out there, but it's not utilized very effectively. Typically what we do is we go out and we do certain areas of the field. But just like any other test, the more intensive the test is, the better it's going to be. And that's one of the challenges with the nitrate test. Soil conductivity is not that good, but one of the things that actually is a pretty good explanation of whether you need more nitrogen is corn color. Okay? So that's kind of the work that Peter showed was, it's not perfect, but it's certainly better than a lot of the tools that we use today. And there's a reason for that. If you go to a cornfield and you see some yellowing in that field, we tend to think of a nitrogen deficiency, right? You guys, your eyes pick up that difference. In that chlorophyll molecule, there's about 50 to 70% of the nitrogen is in that chlorophyll molecule. Okay, so there's definitely a correlation between the color of the corn and the nitrogen content, and that's the whole concept behind these optical sensors. So look at a field right here. This is actually 2 years ago. Okay, and you can see there's green areas of a field and those yellow areas. So if that was your farm, what nutrient do you think that's probably short of? Nitrogen, right? That's pretty typical with it, and that's indeed what some N stress taking place in that field. And so the question is, you know, how can we get more nitrogen and things and something like that? But the corn color definitely shows some differences there. So here's the question. is could optical sensors be used to assess real-time nitrogen availability in crops? So when you go out there and these biological systems are working and you're getting nitrogen released in crop, you're real time. You can sort of start to pick that up. And we think there's actually some opportunities for that to work. Here's the concept of optical sensors. There's different manufacturers of these, but basically these sensors emit an active light source, and then you get a certain amount of light reflected back, and you measure that. And that's used to calculate what we call a normalized difference vegetation index. Okay, that's what it's doing. Once you have an NDVI, there are then equations that you can use to plug into the software to basically variable apply the nitrogen. Okay, so that's really the concept. You're measuring the color of the corn, and you're translating that to an N rate as you go across the field. This is one that we set up on a machine. Just looking at the sensor, this is where you emit the light source, and this is where the reflected light off the crop canopy is reflected back to calculate that NDVI. Okay, that's kind of what we're doing. So, Steve Mack is still in here? Wave your hand there. Steve is our branch manager at State Line. Had an interest where this kind of got started. We had an interest in some farmers in the west part of our geography that were in narrow corn that really weren't set up to side dress in, but wanted to split apply nitrogen. And so this was a John Deere 4930 set up with a dry box. The idea was to put a base rate of nitrogen on, kind of get through the rainy spring part of the season, and then make it an end-time assessment about 5-6 collar corn and go out there and broadcast urea with, say, Agrotate Ultra on there to put in another layer of nitrogen in crop. So it made some sense. So we started thinking about, hey, maybe taking a look at these optical sensors, and these guys at the branch did a great job of building a boom and putting 3 sensors on the front of that system with it to see what we could learn in terms of how accurate these things actually are. This is just a picture of it in the field. These are designed to run about, this particular sensors are designed to run about 24 to 48 inches above the crop canopy. Okay, so that's where it's kind of set up to run. You can see there's a little box there that feeds into the cab. And this is the rear of the machine. These sensors work on dry boxes, but they work on liquid units, like if you got a Hagie or a Miller or something, and you're injecting 28, the concept's all the same. The communication's all the same. It's just a matter of product, what we're doing. We went this route again because of narrow row corn, trying to be able to go across a wider geography with it. So this is basically the rear of the machine. This is some pretty tall corn. The clearance between the ground and the fans on this is about 66 inches, okay? And I'll explain a little bit here about some of the challenges that come with the system, but that's kind of the window of opportunity that you have to be in there with this particular setup. This is a picture of the field this year. We did some field trials on, and this one here, we can see the corn is a little bit taller. Think back to April and May, what were conditions, right? In June, we were having a lot of rain, right? We'd love to have one of those right now, but that created a little bit of a challenge for us in terms of the height of the corn crop. So here's the steps for optical sensors. There's really 4 steps here. One is you've got to establish a high-end reference strip, okay? The second thing, you then drive these sensors on B9 plus corn. I'll talk why that's the size it's got to be. And that creates a little bit of logistical challenges. The third is to select an algorithm for nitrogen, okay? And the fourth is you drive the field and you variable rate apply the nitrogen. So those are the 4 steps. You've got to establish a high-end reference strip. That's one of the things you've got to do. This is a picture from Jim Camerato, Bob Nielsen, at one of their field trials at one of the research sites. And essentially is you've got to know what good green color looks like of corn. So you got to set the bar, and that would be the same with cover crops, is you've got to go out there and put additional strip of nitrogen on early season so you know you've got enough nitrogen that when you measure the sensor, that's the bar it's supposed to look like. Okay, that's the high part of it. And that just shows you a 250 pounds. Typically this is 40, 50 pounds higher than your standard rate that you put on the field. The next thing you do is you've got to select an algorithm, and this is where we got a little bit work to do in Indiana The algorithm is basically used to take that NDVI reading that you're reading from the crop sensors and converting that to a nitrogen rate. Okay, so there's somebody has to do the research behind the scenes to come up with that equation. And you can see here in this particular unit that there's work done out of Oklahoma State on wheat, there's Oklahoma State on corn, there's Virginia Tech has some coastal plains on corn, and there's Ohio State. Okay, and Ohio State is the one we use because we don't have one for Indiana. And so Robert Mullen, who used to be the extension specialist, nutrition specialist in Ohio State, spent quite a few years on optical sensors developing an equation that looked at the NDVI and then calculating a nitrogen rate as that changes. And this is how this is used. This is a site from a year ago where the reference strip NDVI was 0.89. So we have this high-end reference strip. We drive the field. It calculates an NDVI of 0.89. And then we use the Ohio State algorithm. This is just an example on the monitor here where there's an NDVI of 0.84. That's calculating a nitrogen rate of 75 pounds of product. This is urea that we're spreading. So it's taking that NDVI and calculating it into an actual application rate for fertilizer. So I'll see if I can get this to work here real quick. This is just an example of it running in the field. So this is just the sensors running over the top of the corn canopy. Again, these are running about 24 to 44 inches above that crop canopy. Here's the machine in actual application. The sensors are reading, calculating a rate. You can see the urea coming out of the back of the machine. The technology is pretty slick as far as working. What happens is that's reading. The fans are staying on the machine, and the belt's turning either on or off or speeding up the increased amount of nitrogen across there. Okay, so that's basically how the technology works. So, some of the challenges with optical sensors is the establishment of that high-end reference strip. Okay, I'm listening to the conversation this morning, and Barry, throws a slide up there. It talks about no-till. Cover crops. We're talking about management, aren't we, Barry? I mean, setting up the equipment. I think one of the biggest impedance to the adoption of some of these things is flat management. It's time. It's willing to work with the system to make it work. And this is no different than anything else. If you're interested in sensors, I believe we can get them to work. But I think Steve would tell us back in our experience that it is a management situation. Our trials that we were doing this year, we ended up having some challenges because the corn got too tall. Steve farms on the side there too with it, and his was one of the sites, and it started to rain the week we wanted to run, and we couldn't get in there to get the nitrogen on. But getting this high-end reference strip has got to be done. Maybe that changes down the road, in terms of ways to do it. The window to apply is narrow. It's most accurate in V9 to tassel. Okay, that's a little bit of an hindrance. And the third thing is we don't have the algorithm. Ohio State appears to be close, but not maybe quite where we need it to be. So this is a little bit of graph of where these sensors work. The timing to put this on to run is about V9 to up to tasseling. Okay, so we're past the traditional side dress windows. The reason that's the case in the Indiana work that's been done by Jim and Bob, if you go out on a foot tall corn and you measure the greenness and it looks green, it may not be green all the way through the season. Okay, you may look at it here and say, we got enough nitrogen, but the reality is you run short later. For these sensors to work, and they're pretty good, is you got to get to bigger corn, and that's where the cover crops come in. At some point, that nitrogen is being released. If you can at least get to 9-collar corn, we've probably got a pretty good idea if we're going to have enough nitrogen or how much more nitrogen we're going to need for being released out of those cover crops. So V9 to tassel is the window of opportunity for us. We had corn growing almost a foot a week this year as that internode was elongating and we had those good growing conditions, which was a little bit of a challenge. Here's some of our 2012 results using the Ohio State algorithm. We got 2 sites last year of good data. We collaborated with Purdue on setting these up, where Bob wrote the protocol, come up with the replications, and that's really how you have to do that. So you've got a base rate on the field, And then you have additional incremental rates, so you can see the titration of the response to nitrogen that year. And then you allow the sensors to run strips and just put the nitrogen rate on that it's calling for. In this particular site, this was a low yield environment, like there was several of those last year, about 80 bushel the acre, but you can see the end sensor base rates are actually did a pretty nice job of predicting the nitrogen supply. Okay, so that worked pretty good. This was a higher yielding site in Indiana last year, and last year if you looked at $7 corn, $529 urea, the economically optimum in rate was about 210 pounds. In other words, you could have paid that much for nitrogen. The sensor-based stuff was running more in this 130, 40-pound rate. So you can see that we underapplied using the Ohio State algorithm at that location, and that's one of the little things to be working out yet. So kind of in summary with it, as you think about the system and trying to account for nitrogen release from cover crops, these sensors have some merit. They are, again, a high management type thing, but they do offer a better method to account for in-season variability, in-season nitrogen rate, but it is a high management system. And the things we're finding out is, you've got to look at, again, establishing the reference strip. You've got to look at the timing of not starting until V9 corn to be confident that's going to work. And then you've got to be looking at, kind of fine-tune the algorithm. But certainly the system shows merit. We got two more field trials out this year. Again, we lost one of them just because of the corn was growing fast, and we ended up having to fly some urea on that particular field. So that's kind of it. Anybody we got time for a question or two? I'll move to the next thing. Yes. Yeah. Any questions about putting urea on that point in time of year? There is a little bit. It's a little different strategy because I think everyone would probably agree if I could put that nitrogen below ground, as we talked about. We just didn't have the equipment to do that. So, but if you're not starting at no nitrogen, you usually got a base rate of nitrogen down, and then you're just kind of capping off the end of it. And if you put like a volatilization inhibitor, like ureation inhibitor, like Agritane, your chances of getting rain are pretty good. I would be very hesitant to put a lot of nitrogen out like that. Question. Very good. Okay. Turn it back over to you.